Hello everyone, in today's video I will be narrating stories that I found off of Reddit. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment something down below. But without further ado,
let's get straight into these stories.
after a grueling week of work, I was eager to visit my parents in their countryside home. Living in the city had its perks, but the serenity of the countryside was unmatched. The drive usually took about 4 hours, and I often left in the evening to avoid traffic. One Friday, I started my journey a bit later than usual. By the time I hit the highway, darkness had enveloped the surroundings. The road was familiar, flanked by dense woods and the occasional passing car. About 2 hours into the drive, I noticed a car tailing me closely. I brushed it off, thinking they were probably in a hurry. I switched to the slower lane, expecting them to overtake, but they didn't. Instead, they continued to tail me, their headlights glaring at my rearview mirror. Feeling uneasy, I decided to test the waters. I increased my speed, and so did they. I took a random exit, and they followed. Panic began to set in. Who were they? What did they want? I remembered a police station in a small town about 10 miles away. I decided to head there, but first, I needed to make sure they didn't catch on. I took random turns, went in circles, and even turned off my headlights briefly to throw them off. But they persisted. As I approached the town, my phone buzzed. An unknown number. Hesitantly, I answered, "Hello." A raspy voice responded, "Why are you running?" "We just want to talk." Chills ran down my spine. "Who are you? What do you want?" The voice chuckled, "You'll find out soon." I hung up, my heart pounding. The police station was just a few minutes away. I sped up, praying I'd make it in time. Suddenly, the car behind me accelerated, ramming into my rear bumper. I struggled to maintain control, my mind racing. They were trying to run me off the road. I swerved into a side street, hoping to lose them. The narrow road was lined with old houses, their lights casting eerie shadows. I spotted an alleyway and quickly turned into it, killing my headlights and engine. I ducked, hoping they hadn't seen me. Moments later, their car sped past the alley. I waited, holding my breath, counting the minutes. After what felt like hours, I cautiously started my car and headed to the police station. The officers were sympathetic and concerned. They took down my statement and sent a patrol car to search for the mysterious vehicle. I called my parents, explaining the situation. My father insisted on driving down to escort me back. The following morning, the police informed me that they had found an abandoned car matching the description a few miles out of town. Inside, they found ropes, duct tape, and a collection of sharp tools. The realization hit me hard. Their intentions had been sinister. I was grateful for my narrow escape and decided to move closer to my parents. The trauma of that night lingered, but with time and therapy, I began to heal. Months later, I received a call from the police. They had apprehended 2 suspects involved in a series of highway abductions. My testimony helped solidify the case against them. The trial was set for a few months later. The prosecutor's office contacted me, asking if I would be willing to testify. The thought of facing those men in court was terrifying, but I knew it was crucial for ensuring they couldn't harm anyone else. As the trial date approached, I was a bundle of nerves. I sought counseling to prepare myself mentally and emotionally. My therapist, Dr. Reynolds, was a godsend. She equipped me with coping mechanisms and strategies to handle the stress of the courtroom. The day of the trial, the courtroom was packed. News of the highway abductions had spread, and the case had garnered significant media attention. As I took the stand, I could feel dozens of eyes on me. The weight of the situation pressed down, but I took a deep breath, remembering Dr. Reynolds' advice. The prosecutor began by asking me to recount the events of that night. As I spoke, I avoided looking at the defendants, but out of the corner of my eye, I could see that they sat emotionless, their cold eyes occasionally meeting mine. When the defense attorney began his cross-examination, he tried to poke holes in my story, suggesting that I had overreacted or misunderstood the situation. But I held firm, confident in the truth of my experience. The trial lasted several days, with multiple victims and witnesses sharing their harrowing encounters with the 2 men. The evidence against them was overwhelming. Finally, the jury delivered their verdict, guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced them to life in prison without the possibility of parole. A collective sigh of relief filled the courtroom. After the trial, life slowly returned to normal, but the experience had changed me. I became involved in advocacy work, joining a non-profit organization dedicated to supporting victims of violent crimes. Sharing my story and helping others became a therapeutic outlet. One day, I received a letter with no return address. Hesitantly, I opened it. It was from Clara, the woman from the apartment next door. She had heard about my ordeal and wanted to reach out. She wrote about her journey of healing and how she had started a support group for survivors of domestic violence. Inspired by her resilience, I decided to collaborate with her. Together, we organized workshops, workshops, counseling sessions, and community outreach programs. Our combined efforts made a significant impact, providing a safe space for survivors to heal and rebuild their lives. Years later, as I reflect on those events, I realize that while darkness exists in the world, so does hope, resilience, and the indomitable human spirit. Through unity and support, we can overcome the most daunting challenges and turn our traumas into a force for positive change. I've always been a night owl. The tranquility of the night, with its cool breeze and the soft glow of streetlights, has always been therapeutic for me. I used to take long walks around my neighborhood, headphones in, lost in my thoughts and the music. But after that night, I never walked alone again. It was a typical summer evening. The sun had set, and the streets were bathed in a dim, orange hue. I decided to take a longer route that day, one that would take me through the park and around the lake. The park was usually deserted at this time, which was perfect for me. I loved the solitude. About 20 minutes into my walk, I reached the lake. The water was still, reflecting the moonlight, creating a serene atmosphere. I paused to take in the view, and that's when I noticed him. A man, standing on the other side of the lake, was staring directly at me. He was too far away to make out any distinct features, but his silhouette was unmistakable. I brushed it off, thinking maybe he was just enjoying the view too. I continued my walk, but every time I glanced back, he was there, maintaining the same distance. My heart rate began to pick up. I told myself I was being paranoid, but the feeling of being watched was undeniable. I decided to test my theory. I took a sudden turn into a smaller path that led to a dense wooded area. If he followed, I'd know my suspicions were correct. To my horror, he did. The path was narrow and winding, and the trees overhead blocked out most of the moonlight. I quickened my pace, my footsteps echoing in the silence. But no matter how fast I walked, his footsteps matched mine. Panic set in. I decided to confront him. "Hey, why are you following me?" I shouted, trying to sound brave. No response, just the sound of our footsteps in sync. I had to think fast. I remembered there was a small cafe near the end of the path. It was probably closed, but it had a back door that led to a main road. If I could reach it, I could escape. I sprinted, my heart pounding in my ears. The footsteps behind me grew louder and faster. I could hear them closing in. The cafe was just ahead. I reached the back door, praying it was unlocked. To my relief, it was. I burst through, locking it behind me. I found myself in a dimly lit alleyway. The main road was just a few meters away. I ran towards it, and as I reached the road, I flagged down a passing car. The driver, a middle-aged woman, could see the panic in my eyes. "What's wrong?" she asked. I quickly explained the situation, and she offered to drive me home. As we drove away, I looked back and saw the man standing at the entrance of the alley, watching me. I thanked the woman profusely and rushed into my house, locking all the doors and windows. I didn't sleep at night. The next day, I reported the incident to the police. They patrolled the area for a few days but found no one matching the description. Weeks turned into months, and the incident faded from my memory. Life returned to normal, but one evening, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a soft tapping on my window. I pulled back the curtains, and there he was, the same man, staring at me with cold, emotionless eyes. I screamed and called the police. By the time they arrived, he was gone. They searched the area but found no trace of him. They suggested I stay with a friend or family member for a few days. I decided to stay with my sister, who lived in another city. The change of scenery was good for me, and I felt safe. But one evening, as I was returning from the grocery store, I saw him again. He was standing across the street, watching me. I realized then that he wasn't just a random stalker. He was obsessed with me. I decided to take matters into my own hands. I hired a private investigator to find out who he was. The PI did some digging and discovered that the man was a former patient from a mental institution. He had been released a few months ago and had fixated on me for reasons unknown. The PI advised me to get a restraining order. With the evidence gathered, I was able to get a restraining order against him. The police also increased their patrols around my area, but the fear never left me. Every shadow, every unexpected sound made me jump. A few months into my new life, I started attending group therapy sessions for trauma survivors. It was there that I met Emily, a woman around my age who had gone through a similar ordeal. We quickly bonded over our shared experiences and became close friends. Having someone who understood the constant fear and anxiety was comforting. One evening, after a particularly intense session, Emily and I decided to grab a coffee. As we sat in the dimly lit cafe, sharing our stories, Emily mentioned something that sent chills down my spine. "He always wore a red scarf, right?" she asked hesitantly. I stared at her, my heart pounding. "How did you know that?" I whispered. Emily took a deep breath. "Because I think he's been following me too." She went on to describe incidents eerily similar to mine. The silent figure in the distance, the feeling of being watched, the tapping on the window. The only difference was the red scarf, which I had never mentioned to the police or the PI. We realized that this man wasn't just fixated on one person, he had multiple targets. The thought was terrifying. evening, we decided to join forces and gather as much information as we could about him. With the help of the pie, we discovered that the man's name was Robert. He had been institutionalized after a series of violent incidents in his youth. His obsession with the red scarf stemmed from a traumatic event involving his mother, who always wore a similar scarf. Armed with this information, Emily and I approached the police. They reopened the investigation and, with our combined testimonies, were able to track Robert down. He was found living in a dilapidated house on the outskirts of the city, filled with photos of his various targets, including Emily and me. Robert was taken into custody and sent back to a mental institution. The relief was indescribable. For the first time in years, I felt safe. Emily and I continued to support each other through our healing process. We started a support group for stalking victims, providing them with a safe space to share their stories and find solace. Life slowly returned to normal. The nightmares became less frequent and the fear began to fade, but the experience changed me forever. I became more cautious, more aware of my surroundings. I realized that safety is a privilege, one that can be taken away in an instant. Today, I'm a stronger, more resilient person. I've learned to trust my instincts and never underestimate the importance of community and support. And while the scars of the past will always remain, they serve as a reminder of the strength and courage that lies within us all. I've always been a light sleeper. The faintest noise or change in the environment around me would jolt me awake. I used to think of it as a curse, but one night, it may have saved my life. I lived in a small, one-bedroom apartment on the ground floor of an old building. The neighborhood was generally quiet, with the occasional sounds of cars passing by or children playing in the distance. I had a routine: come home from work, make dinner, watch some TV, and then head to bed. One particular night, I was feeling more exhausted than usual. I had just settled into bed, the soft glow of the streetlights filtering through my curtains, when I heard a faint scratching sound coming from my living room window. I brushed it off as a stray cat or a tree branch, but the sound persisted. Curiosity piqued. I slowly got out of bed and tiptoed to the living room. As I approached the window, the scratching grew louder and more frantic. I peeked through the curtains and was met with a chilling sight. A man, dressed in all black, was trying to pry open my window with a crowbar. Panic set in. My heart raced, and my mind raced even faster. I didn't have a landline, and my cell phone was charging in the bedroom. I considered shouting or banging on the window to scare him off, but I feared that might provoke him. As I weighed my options, the man suddenly stopped and looked around, as if sensing he was being watched. Our eyes locked for a brief moment, and I saw a cold, calculating look in his eyes. He resumed his efforts with renewed vigor, and I knew I had to act fast. I dashed back to my bedroom, grabbed my phone, and dialed 911. I whispered the situation to the operator, who assured me that help was on the way. She advised me to stay on the line and find a safe place to hide. I quickly locked my bedroom door and hid in the closet, clutching my phone tightly. The minutes felt like hours as I listened to the sounds of the intruder making his way into my apartment. I could hear him rummaging through my belongings, opening drawers, and moving furniture. Suddenly, there was a loud crash, followed by a string of curses. It sounded like he had knocked over a lamp or a vase. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't come into the bedroom. After what felt like an eternity, I heard the distant wail of sirens. The intruder seemed to hear them too, as his movements became more hurried. There was a rush of footsteps, and then the sound of the front door slamming shut. A few minutes later, I heard the familiar voices of the police officers. I cautiously emerged from my hiding place and was met with a scene of chaos. My apartment was in shambles, with belongings strewn everywhere. The officers took my statement and assured me they would do everything they could to catch the burglar. The following days were a blur. I was constantly on edge, jumping at every sound and shadow. I installed security cameras and reinforced my windows and doors. I even considered moving, but I couldn't afford it at the time. One evening, as I was returning home from work, I noticed a car parked outside my building. It was an old, beat-up sedan with tinted windows and a familiar figure sitting inside. He was the burglar. Our eyes met, and he gave me a sinister smile. Panic set in, and I quickly ran inside, locking the door behind me. I called the police, but by the time they arrived, the man and the car were gone. The police increased patrols in the area and advised me to stay vigilant. They also provided me with a panic button, which would alert them immediately if I felt threatened. Weeks turned into months, and the fear began to subside. I started to feel safe again, believing that the burglar had moved on, but I couldn't have been more wrong. One evening, as I was getting ready for bed, I received a text message from an unknown number. It read, "I'm watching you." My heart sank as I realized the burglar was still out there, taunting me. I immediately called the police, who traced the number to a burner phone. They advised me to change my number and be cautious about sharing it with others. The following weeks were filled with more texts, each more menacing than the last. "You can't hide from me. I know where you live. I'm coming for you." I lived in constant fear, always always looking over my shoulder, always expecting the worst. One night, as I was lying in bed, I heard a soft tapping on my window. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I slowly turned my head and saw the familiar face of the burglar, his eyes wide and unblinking. He held up his phone, displaying a text message that read, "I told you I'd find you." I screamed and pressed the panic button, the shrill alarm echoing through the apartment. The burglar fled, but not before leaving a chilly message scrawled on my window, "I'll be back." The police launched a full-scale investigation, using the evidence I had provided to track down the burglar. It turned out he was a career criminal with a long history of break-ins and harassment. He was arrested and charged with multiple offenses, including burglary, stalking, and threatening behavior. The trial was swift, and he was sentenced to several years in prison. I finally felt a sense of relief, knowing that he was behind bars and couldn't harm me. I moved to a new city shortly after, leaving the memories of that terrifying ordeal behind. I've since taken self-defense classes and become more vigilant about my safety. I've also become an advocate for victims of stalking, sharing my story to raise awareness and help others. The new city brought with it a fresh start. The tall buildings, the hustle and bustle of city life, and the anonymity it offered were a welcome change. I found a job at a local library, a peaceful place that allowed me to heal and rebuild my life. Months turned into years, and the memories of the burglar began to fade. I made new friends, adopted a cat named Luna, and even started dating again. Life was good, and I felt like I had finally moved on. However, one evening, as I was closing up the library, I noticed a familiar-looking car parked outside. My heart raced as memories of that old, beat-up sedan came flooding back. I quickly locked the library doors and peered out the window. The car was empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I called the police, who arrived promptly and searched the area. They found no sign of the burglar, but they did discover a note tucked under my car's windshield wiper. It read, "You can't escape your past." The police took the note as evidence and assured me they would keep an eye on the area. They also advised me to be cautious and report any suspicious activity. The following days were filled with anxiety. I constantly checked my surroundings, always expecting to see the burglar lurking in the shadows. I installed security cameras around my apartment and informed my neighbors and coworkers about the situation. One evening, as I was returning home from work, I received a call from an unknown number. I hesitated for a moment, then answered. A familiar, chilly voice greeted me. "Did you miss me?" He was the burglar. He taunted me, saying he had been watching me for months and that he would never let me go. I tried to keep him on the line, hoping the police could trace the call, but he hung up before they could. The police launched a new investigation, using the latest technology to track down the burglar. They discovered that he had been released from prison on parole and had been stalking me ever since. One night, as I was lying in bed, I heard a soft tapping on my window. My heart raced as I recognized the familiar sound. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, but before I could speak, the power went out, plunging the apartment into darkness. I heard the sound of glass shattering, followed by heavy footsteps. The burglar was inside. I quickly hid under the bed, clutching my phone tightly. The footsteps grew louder, coming closer and closer. Suddenly, a bright light illuminated the room, followed by the sound of shouting. The police had arrived, responding to my 911 call. They arrested the burglar, who was armed with a knife and had a sinister plan to exact revenge. The trial was swift, and the burglar was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge commended me for my bravery and resilience, saying I was a true survivor. I finally felt a sense of closure, knowing that the burglar was behind bars for good. I decided to use my experience to help others, becoming a victim's advocate and sharing my story to raise awareness about stalking and personal safety. Today, I live a peaceful life, surrounded by loved ones in a supportive community. I've learned the importance of trusting my instincts and being proactive about my safety. I've also learned that, no matter how dark the past may be, there's always hope for a brighter future. During my college years, I worked as a pizza delivery driver for a local pizzeria. The job was straightforward: take orders, drive to the location, hand over the pizza, and collect the cash. Most nights were mundane, but one particular delivery still haunts me to this day. It was a chilly Friday evening, and the pizzeria was bustling with orders. As I was preparing to leave with a stack of boxes, my manager handed me one last delivery slip. The address was on the outskirts of town, a place I wasn't very familiar with. But with the promise of a good tip, I set off. The drive took me through windy roads and dense woods. The further I went, the fewer houses I saw. The GPS led me to a dilapidated house at the end of a long, gravel driveway. The place looked abandoned, with overgrown grass, broken windows, and a general air of decay. Hesitating for a moment, I decided to proceed. I grabbed the pizza box and approached the front door. Before I could knock, the door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit hallway. A voice from inside beckoned, "Come in and leave the pizza on the table." Every instinct told me to turn around and leave, but the thought of getting a bad review interview or losing my job pushed me forward. I stepped inside, placing the pizza on a dusty table. The air was thick with the smell of mold and dampness. As I turned to leave, I noticed a figure at the end of the hallway. It was a man, tall and gaunt, with wild eyes and a disheveled appearance. He was staring intently at me, not saying a word. Feeling uneasy, I muttered, "That'll be $15.50. The man didn't move. Instead, he continued to stare, his gaze never leaving mine. I repeated the amount, trying to keep my voice steady. Still, no response. Growing more anxious, I decided to leave. "You can call the pizzeria and sort out the payment," I said, heading for the door. But as I reached for the handle, it wouldn't budge. I tried again, pulling with all my might, but it was as if the door was sealed shut. Panic set in. I looked around for another way out, but all the windows were boarded up. The man began to approach, his steps slow and deliberate. I backed away, searching for anything I could use as a weapon. Suddenly, I remembered the pepper spray I kept in my pocket for safety. I pulled it out and aimed it at the man, warning him to stay back. He paused for a moment, a smirk forming on his lips, then lunged at me. I sprayed him directly in the eyes, causing him to scream in pain and stagger back. Seizing the opportunity, I ran towards the back of the house, hoping to find another exit. I stumbled upon a kitchen with a back door. I tried the handle, and to my relief, it opened. I bolted out, not stopping until I reached my car. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking uncontrollably, and sped away from that hellish place. Once I was a safe distance away, I pulled over and called the police. They arrived at the house within minutes, but the man was gone. Inside, they found evidence of someone living there, despite the house being declared abandoned years ago. The police took my statement and launched an investigation. A few days later, they informed me that the man had been captured. He was a wanted fugitive with a history of violent crimes. The pizzeria was his latest target, luring delivery drivers to his hideout with the promise of a large order. I quit my job the next day, vowing never to work in delivery again. The aftermath of that harrowing experience was a whirlwind. Local news outlets caught wind of the story, and within days, I was thrust into the spotlight. Reporters wanted interviews, and the pizzeria was flooded with both concerned customers and those morbidly curious about the incident. The owner of the pizzeria, Mr. Rixai, was deeply apologetic. He offered me compensation and even a different position at the restaurant, but I declined. The trauma was too fresh, and I needed to distance myself from anything that reminded me of that night. As weeks turned into months, the media attention died down, but the impact of the event lingered. I became more reclusive, avoiding social gatherings and often opting to stay indoors. My friends and family were supportive, but they couldn't truly understand the depth of my fear. One evening, as I was aimlessly scrolling through social media, a message notification popped up. It was from a woman named Clara. She introduced herself as a therapist specializing in trauma and explained that she had read about my ordeal. She offered her services, free of charge, believing she could help me navigate my feelings and fears. Skeptical but desperate for some semblance of normalcy, I agreed to meet her. Our sessions began at her cozy office, filled with books and soft lighting. Clara was a gentle soul, her voice soothing and her demeanor kind. She allowed me to open up at my own pace, never pushing or prodding. Over time, I began to trust her. We delved into the events of that night, dissecting every moment, every emotion. Clara introduced me to various coping mechanisms and techniques to handle my anxiety. Slowly, I began to heal. One day, during a particularly intense session, Clara shared a personal story. She too had been a victim of a traumatic event in her youth. Her journey to recovery had inspired her to become a therapist to help others like herself. This revelation created a deeper bond between us, knowing that she truly understood my pain. Months turned into years, and with Clara's guidance, I rebuilt my life. I went back to college, earned my degree, and started my own business. The memories of the pizza delivery and the man in the dilapidated house faded, replaced by new, happier memories. Clara and I remained close, our relationship evolving from therapist-patient to genuine friends. We often met for coffee, discussing everything from our personal lives to our shared passion for mental health advocacy. One day, Clara approached me with an idea. She wanted to start a support group for trauma survivors, a safe space for people to share their stories and find solace in one another. She believed that our combined experiences could make a real difference. Together, we founded Healing Together, a non-profit organization dedicated to helping trauma survivors. We organized weekly meetings, workshops, and events, creating a community of support and understanding. The response was overwhelming. People from all walks of life joined our group, sharing their stories and finding comfort in knowing they weren't alone. We received letters and messages from members expressing their gratitude and detailing their journeys to recovery. Looking back, I realized that the terrifying ordeal with the pizza delivery was a turning point in my life. It led me to Clara, to a deeper understanding of myself, and to a purpose greater than I could have ever imagined. Today, as I stand in front of a room full of trauma survivors, sharing my story and listening to theirs, I'm filled with gratitude. Gratitude for the second chance at life, for the opportunity to make a difference, and for the knowledge that even in our darkest moments, there's always a glimmer of hope. I wake up at 6 a.m., morning run, breakfast, work, dinner, a bit of reading, and then bed. My life was predictable, and I liked it that way, but everything changed when I noticed him, the man who would become my persistent shadow. It started innocuously enough. I was on my morning run, taking my usual route through the park, when I felt the sensation of being watched. I glanced around and spotted a man on a bench, his gaze fixed intently on me. He was of average height, with unkempt hair and a scruffy beard. Our eyes met briefly, and then I continued on my way, brushing off the encounter as a mere coincidence. But as days turned into weeks, I began to see him everywhere. At the coffee shop, outside my office, near my home. He was always at a distance, never approaching, just watching. At first, I tried to convince myself that I was being paranoid, but the frequency of our encounters was too high to be mere happenstance. One evening, as I was leaving work, I found a note tucked under my car's windshield wiper. It read, "I'm always watching." The shiver ran down my spine. This was no longer a series of coincidences. I was being stalked. I reported the incidents to the police, providing them with a description of the man in the note. They promised to keep an eye out, but mentioned that without any direct threats or evidence, there wasn't much they could do. Determined to take matters into my own hands, I decided to change up my routine. I switched coffee shops, took different routes to work, and even joined a gym to avoid my morning runs in the park. For a while, it seemed to work. The sightings decreased, and I began to feel a semblance of normalcy return. But one night, as I was settling into bed, I heard a tapping sound on my window. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I mustered the courage to peek through the blinds. It was met with the chilling sight of the man, his face pressed against the glass, his breath fogging it up. Our eyes locked, and he mouthed the words, "You can't hide." I screamed to dial 911. The police arrived within minutes, but the man had vanished. They conducted a thorough search of the area but found no trace of him. They advised me to stay with a friend or family member for a few days. I took their advice and moved in with my sister, Sarah, who lived across town. She was supportive and understanding, offering comfort and a listening ear. For a week, I stayed with her, hoping that the distance would deter my stalker. But one evening, as Sarah and I were watching a movie, her phone buzzed with a notification. It was a message from an unknown number with a photo attached. The photo was of me, taken from outside the window, with the caption, "I found you." We immediately called the police, who advised us to stay indoors and lock all doors and windows. They dispatched a patrol car to our location and began tracing the origin of the message. The next few hours were a blur of fear and anxiety. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the trees outside, sent us into a panic. We huddled together in the living room, waiting for an update from the police. Finally, in the early hours of the morning, we received a call. The police had traced the message to a nearby motel. They had arrested the man, who turned out to be a former coworker of mine. He had become obsessed with me after I had rejected his advances at a company party. Unable to cope with the rejection, he had spiraled into a dangerous obsession, tracking my every move and documenting it with photos and notes. The relief I felt was indescribable. The nightmare was finally over. The man was charged with stalking, harassment, and breaking and entering. He was sentenced to several years in prison, with mandatory psychological counseling. Months after the ordeal, life began to regain a semblance of normalcy. The trauma, however, had left its mark. I became more cautious, always double-checking locks and being wary of unfamiliar faces. My relationships with friends and family deepened, as they had been my rock during the darkest times. One day, as I was leaving a therapy session, I bumped into a woman named Emily. She was in the same support group as me, and we had shared our stories with each other. Emily had been stalked by an ex-boyfriend and had faced a similar journey of fear, recovery, and empowerment. Over coffee, Emily and I discussed the idea of turning our support group into a more structured organization. We envisioned a safe haven for victims, offering resources, counseling, and legal assistance. With our shared passion and determination, Safe Steps was born. Safe Steps became more than just a support group, it was a movement. We organized workshops, self-defense classes, and awareness campaigns. We collaborated with law enforcement agencies, providing them with insights and training on handling stalking cases. As the organization grew, so did our team. We hired counselors, legal advisors, and security experts. We also launched a helpline, offering 24/7 support to victims in distress. One of our most impactful initiatives was the buddy system. Recognizing that many victims felt isolated and vulnerable, we paired them with volunteers who would accompany them to places they felt unsafe, like court hearings or even just grocery shopping. The feedback was overwhelmingly positive. Many expressed that having someone by their side, someone who understood their fears, made all the difference. It was heartwarming to see the bonds that formed between buddies, with many evolving into lifelong friendships. As years passed, Safe Steps expanded nationally. We received endorsements from celebrities and even partnered with tech companies to develop safety apps for victims. Our story was featured in documentaries, talk shows, and news segments, bringing attention to the silent epidemic of stalking. One day, during a Safe Steps event, I was approached by a young woman. She introduced herself as Lisa and shared her story. She had been stalked by a classmate and had lived in constant fear, but after discovering Safe Steps, she had found the courage to report her stalker and seek therapy. With tears in her eyes, she thanked me, saying that our organization had saved her life. That moment was a stark reminder of why I had started this journey. It wasn't just about my healing, it was about creating a ripple effect, empowering others to reclaim their lives. Today, as I reflect on my journey, I'm filled with gratitude. Gratitude for the support I received, for the lessons I learned, and for the opportunity to make a difference. My ordeal with the stalker was undoubtedly the darkest chapter of my life, but it led me to my life's purpose. In the face of adversity, I had found strength, resilience, and a community that stood by me. And while the scars of the past will always remain, they serve as a reminder that even in our darkest moments, there's always a glimmer of hope. The allure of Europe had always beckoned me. The rich history, diverse cultures, and stunning landscapes were things I had only read about or seen in movies. So when I finally saved enough for a month-long trip across the continent, I was ecstatic. My journey began at the bustling streets of London, meandered through the romantic avenues of Paris, and then led me to the sun-soaked coasts of Spain. But it was in Italy and a small town on the Amalfi coast that my dream vacation took a disconcerting turn. I had rented a small apartment through a popular home sharing site. The host, Marco, was friendly and our online interactions, providing me with detailed instructions and local recommendations. The apartment was a dream, a quaint little space overlooking the azure waters of the Mediterranean. On my second day, after a long excursion exploring the town, I returned to find a fresh bouquet of flowers on the dining table. Assuming it was a kind gesture from Marco, I sent him a thank you message. His reply was swift: "I didn't leave you any flowers." A bit puzzled, I thought perhaps it was a mix-up or a gift from a neighboring apartment. I brushed it off and went about my evening. The next morning, I discovered a small note tucked under the front door. "You look beautiful in the market today," it read. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I hadn't told anyone about my plans, and Marco was the only person who knew I was staying there. Growing concerned, I decided to be more vigilant. I started noticing a man, probably in his late 30s, with dark hair and a perpetual 5 o'clock shadow. He was always there, at the cafe when I had my morning coffee, on the beach when I went for a swim, and even at the local pizzeria in the evenings. His presence was subtle, but the pattern was undeniable. One evening, as I was returning from a day trip to a neighboring town, I felt an unsettling sensation of being followed. Quickening my pace, I darted through alleyways and doubled back several times. When I finally reached the apartment, out of breath and shaken, I bolted the door and checked all the windows. That night, I received a message on my phone from an unknown number. "Why were you running?" "I just wanted to talk." Panic sudden, I contacted the local police and showed them the messages and the note. They promised to patrol the area and advised me to stay indoors for the night. The next morning, I decided to confront Marco, thinking he might know the man or have some explanation. To my surprise, Marco was genuinely concerned and claimed he had no knowledge of the man. He even offered to let me stay at his family's place for added safety. Reluctantly, I agreed. That evening, Marco introduced me to his family, and we shared a traditional Italian meal. The warmth and hospitality were a welcome distraction from the unnerving events. Later, as we sat on the porch sipping wine, Marco's grandmother shared stories of the town's history. When I described the man who had been following me, her face turned grave. She spoke of a local man, once smitten by a tourist who had tragically died in a boating accident years ago. Since then, he had become reclusive, occasionally fixating on visiting women who reminded him of his lost love. The story was heartbreaking, but it didn't excuse the man's behavior. The next day, with Marco by my side, we approached the man. We found him at the same cafe, his eyes distant, lost in thought. The confrontation was emotional, with the man expressing his loneliness and grief. While sympathetic, we firmly told him his actions were unacceptable and that he needed professional help. The remainder of my trip was uneventful. Marco and his family became my guardians, ensuring I felt safe and welcome. As I prepared to leave, Marco handed me a letter. It was an apology from the man, expressing his remorse and revealing he had sought counseling. Upon my return home, the memories of Europe were a constant topic of conversation. Friends and family were eager to hear about the historic sites, the food, and the people. But when I recounted the unsettling events in Italy, the atmosphere would always shift from one of excitement to concern. The experience experience, while unnerving, had also given me a profound insight into the complexities of human behavior. It made me realize that behind every action, no matter how unsettling, there's often a story, a reason, a past. A few months later, I received an unexpected email from Marco. He updated me on the happenings of the town and his family, but what caught my attention was the news about the man whose name I learned was Antonio. He had been attending therapy and had even joined a local support group for people dealing with grief and loss. The community, initially wary of him due to the stories circulating, began to see the change in him and slowly started to accept him back. Marco also mentioned that Antonio had taken up painting, channeling his emotions onto the canvas. He had even held a small exhibition in the town, showcasing his work, which depicted the beauty of the Amalfi coast and portraits of a woman, presumably his lost love. Reading about Antonio's journey towards healing was bittersweet. While I could never condone his actions, I felt a sense of relief knowing he was finding his way back to a semblance of normalcy. The years rolled on, and life got busy. I advanced in my career, moved cities, and traveled to new destinations. But the Amalfi coast and its memories remain etched in my heart. On a whim, 5 years after my initial trip, I decided to revisit the town. I reconnected with Marco, who was now running the family's vineyard, and was welcomed back with open arms. The town, with its familiar streets and stunning vistas, felt like returning to an old friend. One evening, as I was wandering through the town square, I stumbled upon an art gallery. The paintings displayed in the window were strikingly familiar. Upon entering, I realized it was Antonio's studio. Our eyes met, and there was a moment of recognition. The atmosphere was thick with unsaid words. He approached me, his demeanor calm and composed. I wasn't sure if we'd ever meet again. He began, "I owe you a deep apology. Your confrontation, your words, they were a wake-up call for me." We spoke at length, with Antonio sharing his journey of self-discovery and healing. He expressed his gratitude, acknowledging that our encounter, however distressing, was the catalyst for his transformation. As I left the studio, a sense of closure washed over me. The town, which had once been a backdrop for fear and anxiety, had transformed into a testament to human resilience and the power of second chances. My trip to Europe, meant to be a simple vacation, had evolved into a profound journey of understanding, forgiveness, and growth. It was a stark reminder that life, with all its twists and turns, has a way of coming full circle. I've always been an independent spirit. Growing up in a small town, I often found myself yearning for the excitement and unpredictability of city life. So, when I got a job offer in a bustling metropolis, I didn't think twice before packing my bags. The city was everything I had imagined and more. The constant hum of activity, the diverse mix of people, and the endless opportunities for exploration kept me on my toes. I quickly settled into a routine, making friends, and exploring my new surroundings. One evening, after a particularly grueling day at work, I decided to unwind at a local bar. It was a cozy place, with dim lighting and soft jazz playing in the background. I took a seat at the bar, ordered a drink, and lost myself in the ambience. A few drinks in, a man took the seat next to me. He was in his mid-30s, with sharp features and a charismatic aura. We struck up a conversation, discussing everything from our favorite books to our travel adventures. He introduced himself as Alex. As the night wore on, I began to feel a bit lightheaded. I attributed it to the alcohol and decided to call it a night. Alex offered to walk me to my apartment, which was a few blocks away. Given the late hour and my slightly inebriated state, I hesitated but eventually agreed. We walked in comfortable silence, the city's nighttime sounds echoing around us. As we neared my apartment, Alex made a suggestion. "There's a great view from the rooftop of my building. Would you like to see it?" In my tipsy state, the idea seemed appealing. I nodded, and we diverted our routes. His building was a few streets away from mine, a tall structure with a modern facade. We took the elevator to the top floor and then climbed a flight of stairs to the rooftop. The view was indeed breathtaking. The city's skyline stretched out before us, a sea of lights against the inky blackness. We sat on the ledge, our feet dangling over the edge, lost in the beauty of the moment. Suddenly, I felt a strong hand grip my wrist. Startled, I turned to see Alex, his friendly demeanor replaced by a sinister glare. "You shouldn't trust strangers," he whispered, his grip tightening. Panic set in. I tried to pull away, but he was too strong. My mind raced, searching for a way out. I remembered the self-defense techniques I had learned in a workshop a few months ago. Mustering all my strength, I drove my elbow into his stomach, causing him to momentarily loosen his grip. I then kicked him in the shin and made a run for the stairwell. My heart pounded in my chest as I descended the stairs, the sound of Alex's footsteps echoing behind me. I burst out of the building and into the street, screaming for help. A passing patrol car heard my cries and came to my aid. The police apprehended Alex, who, as it turned out, had a history of assault and had been on probation. They commended me for my quick thinking and bravery. In the aftermath, I grappled with a mixture mix of emotions: relief at my narrowed escape, anger at Alex for his actions, and guilt for letting my guard down. I sought therapy to process the trauma and joined a support group for survivors of assault. The weeks following the incident were a blur. My friends and family rallied around me, offering support and comfort. My apartment, once a haven, now felt tainted with the memory of that night. I decided to move, finding a new place in a different part of the city. Work became my refuge. I immersed myself in projects, using them as a distraction from the trauma. My colleagues, aware of my ordeal, were understanding and supportive. They often checked in on me, offering words of encouragement and ensuring I felt safe. One day, as I was leaving the office, I was approached by a journalist from a local newspaper. She had heard about my story and wanted to interview me. Initially hesitant, I eventually agreed, seeing it as an opportunity to raise awareness about personal safety. The article was published a week later, detailing my experience and highlighting the importance of self-defense training. The response was overwhelming. I received messages from strangers thanking me for sharing my story and expressing their admiration for my courage. Encouraged by the positive feedback, I decided to take things a step further. I collaborated with a local self-defense instructor and organized workshops for women in the community. The sessions covered basic techniques, situational awareness, and the psychological aspects of self-defense. The workshops were a hit, with participants ranging from college students to elderly women. The sense of empowerment and camaraderie was palpable. Many shared their personal experiences, finding solace in the knowledge that they weren't alone. As months turned into years, my life began to regain a semblance of normalcy. The memories of that night faded, replaced by new, happier ones. But the impact of the experience remained, shaping my outlook on life and my sense of purpose. I founded a non-profit organization, Empower Her, dedicated to promoting personal safety and empowerment for women. We expanded our workshops, partnering with schools, colleges, and corporations. We also launched a helpline, offering support and resources to victims of assault. One of the most rewarding aspects of my work was the stories of impact. I received countless letters and emails from women who had attended our workshops, sharing how the training had helped them in real-life situations. Their testimonials were a testament to the importance of our mission. Looking back, I realized that while the encounter with Alex was undoubtedly the darkest chapter of my life, it also led me to my life's purpose. It taught me the value of resilience, the power of community, and the importance of turning adversity into advocacy. Today, as I stand in front of a room full of eager participants, ready to embark on another workshop, I'm filled with gratitude. Gratitude for the second chance at life, for the opportunity to make a difference, and for the knowledge that even in our darkest moments, there's always a glimmer of hope. It was a typical Friday evening. I had just finished a long week at work and was heading to my parents' house for the weekend. They lived in a rural town about 3 hours away, and I often made the drive to visit them. About halfway through the journey, as the sun began to set, I realized I was running low on gas. I pulled off the highway and into a small, run-down gas station. The place looked like it hadn't been renovated in decades, with peeling paint and flickering neon lights. But it was the only station for miles, so I didn't have much choice. As I began to fill up my tank, I noticed a man standing by the entrance of the convenience store attached to the station. He was tall, with greasy hair and a tattered jacket. He seemed to be staring at me intently, which immediately put me on edge. Trying to shake off the uneasy feeling, I quickly finished pumping gas and decided to head inside to grab a snack for the road. As I entered the store, I noticed the man had moved closer to my car, still watching me. The store was empty except for the cashier, a middle-aged woman who looked just as weary as the store itself. I grabbed a bag of chips and a soda and made my way to the counter. As I paid, I mentioned the man outside to the cashier, hoping she might know him or have an explanation for his behavior. She glanced outside and her face turned pale. "That's Dale," she whispered. "He's been hanging around here for the past few days. Keeps to himself mostly, but he's given a few customers the creeps. I've called the cops, but they say unless he does something, there's not much they can do." Feeling even more uneasy, I thanked her and quickly exited the store. To my horror, Dale was now leaning against my car, his face pressed up against the window, peering inside. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He slowly turned to face me, his eyes vacant and glassy. "You shouldn't be here," he murmured, his voice low and gravelly. I felt a rush of adrenaline. "Please move away from my car," I said firmly. He continued to stare at me for what felt like an eternity before slowly backing away. I quickly got into my car, locked the doors, and sped away, my heart racing. As I merged back onto the highway, I glanced in my rearview mirror and saw Dale standing in the middle of the road, watching me. The image of his silhouette against the dimmy light was one I would never forget. I drove the rest of the way to my parents' house without stopping, constantly checking my mirrors, half expecting to see Dale following me. When I finally arrived, I was a bundle of nerves, recounting the ordeal to my parents. My dad, always the protective type, wanted to drive back to the gas station and confront Dale, but but I convinced him it wasn't a good idea. Instead, we reported the incident to the local police, who promised to look into it. The next day, as I was having breakfast, my mom showed me a news article on her phone. The headline read, "Local man arrested for assault at gas station." The article went on to describe how Dale had attacked a customer at the same gas station later that night. Thankfully, the victim had managed to escape and call the police, leading to Dale's arrest. The article also mentioned that Dale had a history of mental illness and had recently stopped taking his medication. He had been living on the streets and had taken to hanging around the gas station, where he felt drawn to the lights, as he later told the police. I shuddered, thinking about how close I had come to a potentially dangerous situation. I was grateful for my intuition and the warning from the cashier, which had likely saved me from a similar fate. The incident served as a stark reminder of the unpredictability of life and the importance of always being aware of one's surroundings. It also reinforced my belief in trusting one's gut instincts, no matter how seemingly trivial they might be. In the weeks that followed, I often thought about Dale and hoped he would get the help he needed. I also made a point to always fill up my gas tank during daylight hours and to avoid isolated places, especially when traveling alone. The incident at the gas station became a turning point in my life. The close call made me reevaluate my priorities and the way I approached everyday situations. I became more involved in community safety initiatives, attending town hall meetings and advocating for better lighting and security measures in public spaces. One evening, after a community meeting, I was approached by a woman named Clara. She introduced herself as a psychologist who worked with individuals suffering from mental health issues. She had read about my encounter with Dale and was interested in collaborating on a project. Together, we conceptualized a community outreach program aimed at bridging the gap between mental health awareness and public safety. The program, named Safe Minds, offered workshops that educated the public about mental health, the importance of early intervention, and how to respond in potentially dangerous situations. Safe Minds gained traction quickly. Local schools, businesses, and community centers expressed interest in hosting our workshops. We also partnered with local law enforcement, ensuring they were equipped to handle situations involving individuals with mental health issues. As the months rolled on, Clara and I became close friends. We often shared personal stories, and I learned that her interest in mental health was deeply personal. Her younger brother had schizophrenia and had faced numerous challenges, from misdiagnosis to societal stigma. Clara's passion for the cause was palpable, and it fueled our mission. One day, as we were wrapping up a workshop at a high school, a student approached us. Tearfully, she shared that her mother suffered from bipolar disorder and that their family often felt isolated and misunderstood. Our workshop, she said, had given her hope and a sense of belonging. It was moments like these that underscored the importance of our work. Word of Safe Minds spread, and we began receiving invitations to speak at conferences and events across the state. The feedback was overwhelmingly positive, with many sharing their personal stories and expressing gratitude for the resources and support our program provided. 2 years after the inception of Safe Minds, I received news that Dale had been released from custody and was undergoing rehabilitation at a mental health facility. With Clara's encouragement, I decided to visit him. Our meeting was emotional. Dale, now on proper medication and therapy, was a shadow of the menacing figure I had encountered that fateful evening. He expressed deep remorse for his actions and shared his struggles with mental illness. The conversation was cathartic, offering closure to a chapter that had profoundly impacted my life. Today, as I reflect on my journey, I'm filled with a mix of emotions: gratitude for the second chance at life, pride in the positive impact of Safe Minds, and hope for a future where mental health is understood and prioritized. Life has a way of presenting challenges when we least expect them, but it's how we respond to these challenges that defines us. My encounter at the gas station, while terrifying, set me on a path of advocacy, awareness, and personal growth. It was a stark reminder that every experience, no matter how harrowing, offers a lesson and an opportunity for growth. I've always enjoyed my trips to Target. There's something about the store's organized layout and the variety of products that makes shopping there a pleasant experience. But one evening, my routine trip turned into an ordeal I'd never forget. It was a Thursday evening, around 7 p.m. The store was relatively empty, with only a few shoppers scattered throughout. I had a short list of items to pick up: some toiletries, a birthday card for my niece, and a new pair of headphones. As I was browsing the headphones section, I felt a presence behind me. I turned around and saw a man, probably in his late 40s, staring intently at the headphones. He had greasy, unkempt hair, a scruffy beard, and wore a tattered jacket despite the warm weather. I gave him a polite nod and continued browsing, but I couldn't shake off the feeling that he was watching me. I decided to move on to the toiletries section, hoping to shake off the uneasy feeling. But as I walked down the aisle, I noticed the man was following me. He kept a distance, but it was clear he was tailing me. I tried to convince myself that it was just a coincidence, but my gut told me otherwise. To test my theory, I made a sudden turn into the toy section, a place I had no intention of visiting. Sure enough, he followed. I felt a chill run down my spine. I decided to confront him. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to sound firm. He looked taken aback, his eyes darting around. "Just shopping," he mumbled, avoiding eye contact. I decided to head to the front of the store, hoping to find a security guard or an employee. But as I walked, I noticed the man was no longer following me. I felt a momentary sense of relief, thinking he had given up. I quickly grabbed a birthday card and made my way to the checkout. As I was paying, I glanced towards the store's entrance and saw the man again. He was talking to another man who looked equally disheveled. They both kept glancing in my direction. Panic set in. I decided to ask the cashier for help. "Excuse me," I whispered. "Those two men by the entrance have been following me around the store. I'm really scared." The cashier, a young woman probably in her early 20s, looked concerned. "Stay here," she said, picking up the store phone. Within minutes, two security guards approached the men. I watched from a distance as they spoke. The men seemed agitated, pointing in my direction. After what felt like an eternity, the guards escorted the men out of the store. The cashier, whose name tag read Mia, came over to me. "Are you okay?" she asked. I nodded, still shaken. "Thank you," I whispered. Leah explained that the two men were known to the store's security. They had been caught shoplifting multiple times and had been banned from the premises. She suspected they were up to no good tonight. I thanked Mia and the security guards profusely. They offered to escort me to my car, which I gratefully accepted. As we walked out, I noticed a beat-up van parked near the entrance. The two men were inside, watching me. The security guards made sure I got into my car safely and waited until I drove off. That night, I lay in bed, replaying the events over and over. I was grateful for Mia and the security guards, but I couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched. I decided to report the incident to the local police, just in case. A few days later, I received a call from a detective. He informed me that the two men had been arrested for a series of burglaries in the area. They had been using the Target parking lot as a base to scout potential victims. I was horrified to think of what could have happened if I hadn't trusted my instincts. A few weeks after the incident, I decided to drop by Target again. This time, I went during the day, thinking it would be safer. As I entered the store, I was greeted by familiar faces. Mia was at the checkout, and she gave me a warm smile. "Hey, good to see you back," she said. "Thanks, Mia. I couldn't stay away for too long," I replied, trying to sound upbeat. I went about my shopping, feeling a sense of normalcy, but every so often, I'd catch myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see those two men lurking in the shadows. The trauma of that night still lingered. As I was browsing the home goods section, a store announcement came on. "Attention shoppers, we'd like to remind everyone to always be aware of your surroundings and report any suspicious activity to our staff. Your safety is our top priority." I felt a pang of gratitude. It was clear that the store had taken the incident seriously and was making efforts to ensure the safety of its customers. Later, as I was checking out, Mia pulled me aside. "Hey, I wanted to let you know that after what happened, the store has ramped up its security measures. We've installed more cameras, and there's always a security guard on duty now." I nodded, appreciating the store's efforts. "Thank you, Mia. It means a lot." She smiled. "Just doing our part. And remember, always trust your gut." I left the store feeling a renewed sense of confidence. The world can be a scary place, but there are also good people out there, like Mia, who are willing to step up and help when needed. Over the next few months, I made a conscious effort to overcome my fear. I attended a self-defense class, started carrying pepper spray, and always made sure to park in well-lit areas. I also became more vigilant, always being aware of my surroundings. One day, as I was leaving Target, I noticed a woman looking anxious. She kept glancing around nervously and seemed hesitant to walk to her car. Remembering my own experience, I approached her. "Hey, are you okay?" I asked. She looked up, startled, and, yeah, I thought I saw someone following me earlier." I nodded, understanding her fear. "Would you like me to walk you to your car?" She looked relieved. "Yes, please. Thank you." As we walked to her car, I shared my own experience with her. She listened intently, nodding and understanding. "It's so scary," she said, "but I'm glad there are people like you who are willing to help." I smiled. We have to look out for each other. That day, I realized that while we can't control the actions of others, we can choose how we respond. By being vigilant, trusting our instincts, and looking out for one another, we could create a safer environment for everyone. And while I'll never forget that fateful night in aisle 7, I've also learned that fear doesn't have to control us. With the right mindset and support, we can overcome anything. My wife, Lisa, and I had always been avid hikers. The thrill of conquering new trails, the serenity of nature, and the bond it forged between us were things we cherished. For our 5th anniversary, we decided to tackle a trail we'd heard about but never ventured on, the Whispery Pines Trail. It was said to be one of the most beautiful yet least traveled trails in the Rockies. The morning of our hike was crisp and clear. We started early, our backpacks loaded with essentials and a picnic lunch. The trail lived up to its reputation with breathtaking views of the mountains and valleys. The dense pine forest that surrounded us seemed to whisper with the wind, giving the trail its name. Around noon, we found a picturesque spot overlooking a valley and decided to stop for lunch. As we ate, Lisa pointed out a figure in the distance, making its way up the trail. It was a man hiking alone. We didn't think much of it. After all, we weren't the only ones who knew about this trail. However, as the afternoon wore on, we began to notice the man was always there, maintaining a consistent distance behind us. Every time we stopped for a break or to take in the view, he'd stop too. It was subtle, but there was a deliberate pattern to his movements. Lisa whispered to me, "Do you think he's following us?" I tried to brush off the concern. "It's a public trail, Lisa. Maybe he's just hiking at the same pace." But as the hours passed, my unease grew. The man never got close enough for us to see his face clearly, but he was always there, lurking in the background. By late afternoon, the trail had become more rugged, and we decided to head back to our starting point. But when we turned around, the man was gone. We scanned the trail and the surrounding woods but saw no sign of him. Relieved, we quickened our pace, eager to get back to our car. But as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the trail, we heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind us. We turned around and saw the man, now much closer. He was tall, with a scruffy beard and wore a tattered jacket. His eyes, cold and unblinking, were fixed on us. Panicking, Lisa and I began to run. The trail was treacherous, with loose rocks and steep drops, but fear propelled us forward. We could hear the man's footsteps steadily gaining on us. Suddenly, Lisa tripped, twisting her ankle. I helped her up, and we tried to keep moving, but our pace was slowed. The man was now only a few meters behind us. In a desperate bid to escape, we veered off the trail, plunging into the dense forest. The underbrush was thick, slowing us down, but we pushed on, hoping to lose him. After what felt like hours, we stumbled upon an old cabin hidden amongst the trees. The door was slightly ajar, and we quickly went inside, barricading the door with a wooden plank we found inside. The cabin was dark and smelled of mold. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling, and a thick layer of dust covered everything. It was clear no one had been here in years. We listened intently, but all we could hear was the wind rustling through the trees and our own ragged breaths. It seemed we had lost him. As night fell, we decided to stay in the cabin. Going out in the dark, injured and exhausted, was too risky. We found some old blankets and huddled together, trying to stay warm. But just as we were drifting off to sleep, we heard it, a soft scratching at the door. Then a voice, low and raspy, whispered, "I know you're in there." We held our breath, praying he'd go away, but the scratching continued, growing louder and more insistent. Then, with a sudden bang, the door burst open. The man stood there, silhouetted against the moonlight. In his hand, he held a large knife, its blade gleaming. But before he could take a step, a loud growl echoed through the cabin. From the shadows, a large bear emerged, its eyes fixed on the intruder. The man's eyes widened in terror, and he turned and fled, the bear in pursuit. We waited, paralyzed with fear, until the sounds of the chase faded into the distance. When dawn broke, we cautiously made our way back to the trail and eventually to our car. We reported the incident to the local authorities, and they launched a search for the man. A few days later, they found an improvised campsite deep in the woods, with evidence suggesting the man had been living there for months. But there was no sign of him or the bear. Lisa and I were shaken by the ordeal, and it was a long time before we ventured into the wilderness again. But when we did, we were always cautious, always aware of our surroundings. Months turned into years, and the traumatic memories of that fateful hike began to fade, replaced by the demands of daily life. Lisa and I moved to a new city, started new jobs, and welcomed our first child, a beautiful daughter named Mia. But the wilderness, with all its beauty and terror, still called to us. We often shared stories of our adventures with Mia, making sure to leave out the more harrowing details. One summer, when Mia was 7, we decided to take her on her first camping trip. We chose a well-known, family-friendly site far from the Whispery Pines Trail. The trip was wonderful. Leah's laughter as she chased butterflies and her wide-eyed wonder at her first campfire filled our hearts with joy. On the last night of our trip, as we sat around the campfire roasting marshmallows, Mia suddenly looked up, her face pale. "Mom, Dad," she whispered, "who's that man watching us from the trees?" Lisa and I froze, our hearts pounding. We turned to look, and there, at the edge of the clearing, stood a tall figure barely visible in the dim light. It was impossible to tell if it was the same man from years ago, but the chilling sense of deja vu was undeniable. Without a word, I grabbed a burning log from the fire, its flames casting an eerie glow. The figure didn't move. "Stay away from my family," I shouted, my voice filled with rage and fear. The figure remained still for a moment longer, then slowly retreated into the darkness. We quickly packed up our camp and left, not stopping until we reached the safety of our home. The next day, I contacted the park rangers and reported the incident. They promised to investigate, but we never heard back. That was the last time we went camping. The trauma of our encounters with the mysterious man was too much to bear. We sold our camping gear and focused on other hobbies, always staying close to the safety of civilization. Years later, as Mia prepared to leave for college, she asked us about that night. Lee finally shared the full story of our encounter on the Whispery Pines Trail. Mia listened, her eyes wide with fear and fascination. "I can't believe you never told me," she said. "We wanted to protect you," Lisa replied, tears in her eyes. "We never wanted you to live in fear." Leah hugged us tightly. "Thank you," she whispered. "But you know, I've always felt like someone was watching over us, protecting us. Maybe it was that bear from your story." We smiled, taking comfort in the thought. Perhaps, in the vast, mysterious wilderness, there are forces, both good and evil, that we'll never understand. But one thing was certain, our family's bond, forged through love and adversity, was unbreakable. Alright, but that's it. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment something down below. But as always,
Have a nice day.